When NBA fans look into the history of the game, they tend to find that the greatest of the great were not only good at basketball, but they were also great at resurrecting dead franchises or teams on the brink of collapse. What were the Chicago Bulls before Michael Jordan got to town and won championships? I'll answer it for you. They were a franchise that had made the playoffs once in the last 7 years leading up to them drafting Jordan. What were the Cleveland Cavaliers before LeBron James put on their uniform? The literal definition of a lottery team and a joke of a franchise after years of success in the 90s. What were the Boston Celtics before Bill Russell? Well, they weren't bad, but they definitely wouldn't have won 11 out of their 17 championships without him. What was the San Antonio Spurs without Tim Duncan? A team on the brink of collapse because of their aging and injured superstar David Robinson. But once Tim Duncan got there, he immediately began building up the dynasty that was soon to be. All of these players are well known for also building up franchises and saving them, something Chris Paul is very familiar with since he's basically saved every team he's been on. In this video, we'll take a deeper look at every team Chris Paul has saved from the brink of irrelevancy and failure. Let's do this. Not many fans tend to recall this, but Chris Paul actually initiated his career in New Orleans with the Hornets. As the 4th overall pick back in 2005, Paul was expected to do great things for the Hornets. Before drafting Paul, the Hornets were just bursting onto the NBA scene. This team became an actual NBA team in 2003, and from 2003 to 2005, they made the playoffs both years but lost both times in the first round. The year they were fortunate enough to land Chris Paul, they had finished with an atrocious record of 18-64. This is what helped propel the Hornets into the lottery the following year. The year they drafted Chris Paul, their record immediately jumped up. From 18 wins, they went on to win 38 games, and it only rose from there. The Chris Paul effect was in full effect from day one. By his 3rd year in the league, Chris Paul was already lifting his team into the 50-win margin. The 2007-8 season was arguably Chris Paul's greatest season. He lifted the Hornets into the 2nd seed of the Western Conference, and they were just 1 win away from the 1st seed. Paul dominated on every front this season and probably deserved the MVP that year as well. I'll be making a video about him getting snubbed for MVP in the near future, so be on the lookout. For the next 3 years, Chris Paul would keep the Hornets in the playoffs 2 out of the 3 years, with both being first round exits. It was his first stop, and he still wasn't the elite point guard we all know him to be today. Nevertheless, he elevated a newborn franchise into relevancy for a 6-year period, and I feel like this isn't talked about enough. Who knows where the franchise would be without Chris Paul? The Hornets team would be the first of many that Chris Paul would pull out of the darkness. After helping lift the Hornets into their first set of golden years, Chris Paul was now on the move and off to his next victimized franchise. For decades, the LA Clippers franchise had been the little brother of the Los Angeles sports teams. With no championship banners to their names or even an NBA Finals appearance, the Clippers were never taken seriously, and right before Chris Paul got there, they were only kept alive by their entertaining stars. Before Chris Paul ended up in LA in the 2011-2012 season, the Clippers were going through one of the greatest playoff basketball droughts in NBA history. In 20 years leading up to the acquisition of Chris Paul, the Clippers franchise had a total of 4 playoff appearances in those 20 years. In fact, in the 41 years of the Clippers' existence before Chris Paul got there, the Clippers had only made the playoffs 6 times. 6 playoff appearances in 41 years. This is, without a question, the most underrated playoff drought in NBA history. Little did the Clippers know that their golden era was about to begin. The first year Chris Paul spent with the Clippers, he was a lead MVP candidate and helped the Clippers to a 40-26 record, which led to their first playoff appearance in 6 years. Paul's elite point guard skills made an immediate impact. Part of the reason why they were so successful so quickly was because Chris Paul not only brought his own game, but he also brought out the best in every player already on that team. Players like Blake Griffin and DeAndre Jordan, 2 guys that weren't affecting winning basketball, were now key pieces, and they each dominated in their respective roles because of Chris Paul. Jordan's field goal percentage and points per game jolted up. Jordan led the league in field goal percentage 5 times in his career. All were with Chris Paul as his point guard. He somehow also also managed to be on the All-NBA first team, something that Chris Paul greatly attributed to. Blake Griffin was still just as athletically gifted, but even his game started to change and ultimately became an elite all-star who was actually helping his team win games. His scoring also jolted up once Chris Paul joined the team. Shooters like JJ Redick and others were put to real use with Chris Paul commanding the whole offense. This team saw their greatest success in the 2013-14 and 2014-15 season when they made it as far as the Western Conference semifinals both times. They made a Game 7 in 2015, but not the good kind of Game 7. This team was always extremely dominant and unstoppable during the regular season because of their firepower that they had, but they always fell short when it mattered most, and that remains the biggest knockoff, not only to the Clippers franchise as a whole, but it also remains dormant on Chris Paul's career. Still, this team would have never seen the success that they did without Chris Paul's presence. They saw their most success with Chris Paul, which just marks up another franchise that Chris Paul took from the dirt to the top of the mountain. Before making his way to the Oklahoma City Thunder, Chris Paul made a quick stop in Houston, where he saw the most success he's ever seen. He made a Western Conference Finals alongside James Harden, but the reason you can't call this situation one where Chris Paul saved the team was because the Rockets were already good without him. They had James Harden, and they were always a force in the West. Chris Paul just added another dimension to the team, but he never had a hand in taking this team from the bottom to the top because they were never at the bottom. Still, the most personal success Chris Paul saw was with Houston, but after the Rockets traded him to the Thunder, Chris Paul was back to his franchise-saving ways. While in Oklahoma City, many began to question Chris Paul. Now, officially on the downside of his career, many saw this as the last team Chris Paul would be a part of, or one of the last two. Many believed that the Thunder would quickly trade him away or not even play him at all. There was so much speculation and doubt surrounding Thunder Paul, but he quickly proved people wrong. While everyone was predicting a lottery team for the Thunder, Chris Paul had other plans. Before Chris Paul got there, the Thunder were making the playoffs, but they were getting their butts beat in the first round every time with Russell Westbrook. At least this time, the Thunder were going to severely exceed expectations, with or without their best player averaging a triple-double. With a projected win total of 32 games, even with the pandemic ending the season prematurely, the Thunder still went over that, and by a lot. Not only did they win a total of 44 games, as well as clinching the 5th seed in the Western Conference, they also took the Houston Rockets, Paul's old team, to a very close Game 7 in the first round. They did end up losing, but if it were up to the NBA and a majority of the NBA community, they wouldn't have even made the playoff race, let alone the picture. Their chances of making the playoffs were closer to 0% than 1%, and that's a fact. And yet, because of the leadership and resurgence of Chris Paul, they managed to pull off the surprise of the decade. Not only did Chris Paul solve the Thunder's short-term problems, he also solved their long-term concerns. Paul mentored and helped grow the careers of both Shai Gilgeous-Alexander and Dennis Schroeder, two now very elite point guards who are doing their own elite jobs, one on a championship contender and the other one continuing on the legacy that Chris Paul left behind. This was by far Paul's second greatest franchise save because he did it in such a spectacular and unexpected fashion. He did it when everybody in the world doubted him, and that made the moment when they made the playoffs as a 5th seed much sweeter. The Thunder franchise itself wasn't saved by Paul because this was just 1 year, but the team was certainly saved, and one could argue that Chris Paul, the Thunder's future, was safe and secure. The Thunder will always be grateful for what Chris Paul pulled off for them last year, and this just adds to one of the teams that Chris Paul has saved and kept afloat. 1 year after pulling off the surprise of the year, Chris Paul was back at it again, saving failing teams and franchises from themselves. With the Thunder wanting to move in a younger direction, they decided to move on from Chris Paul and they sent him off to the Phoenix Suns. Just a couple of months ago, if you wanted to get a good laugh out of somebody, you would have told them that the Phoenix Suns were gonna make the playoffs. But now, people are having serious conversations about the Suns being championship contenders. So what exactly happened? How did the conversation flip so drastically in a couple of months? The answer is obviously Chris Paul. Ever since the Suns made the acquisition of the offseason when they got Paul, they never looked back. Before Chris Paul landed in Phoenix, the Suns were the laughingstocks of the entire league. The last time the Suns were good came during the years of the Steve Nash era, which ended back in 2010, with that also being the last time they made the playoffs. A whole decade of failure is what followed that lowercase dynasty. Even with a rising star like Devin Booker leading the way, the Suns never won more than 48 games during their playoff drought, which gave them the 9th seed, the closest they ever came to making the postseason. But even after that mildly successful season, things didn't get better, they only got worse. They never won more than 40 games after that season, and they never went higher than the 10th seed. In fact, the Suns were dead last in the Western Conference a total of 4 times after that one season, with 3 of those seasons coming consecutively. Surely you get the picture here. The Phoenix Suns were the worst franchise of the 2010s and literally defined a failure in professional basketball. How could a team like that all of a sudden flip-flop and become the second best team in the West 2 years after only winning 19 games? It's truly incredible how big of an impact one single player can have on a team. Not even LeBron James has made such a record difference for a team, and that says a lot. Chris Paul literally dragged this franchise from darkness and pulled them into the light and into the championship contention conversation. Chris Paul has facilitated Devin Booker's offense as well as DeAndre Ayton's. He's brought out the best in every player on that team this year, and it's even made him a legit MVP candidate for the 2nd consecutive year. Even at the advanced stage of his career, Chris Paul is out here pulling this type of stuff that only LeBron James could do. Chris Paul has had one of the most underrated all-time great careers in NBA history, and this season is proof of that. How can he have made such a drastic difference that he literally took one of the worst teams in basketball and made them one of the 5 best teams in basketball? It's truly mind-boggling and one of the most impressive things ever accomplished in basketball. Chris Paul hasn't gotten enough credit for that, and I think that if the Suns win a championship this year, all of that will change. And that finishes the extensive list of every team Chris Paul has saved. Do you think Chris Paul has been the reason for saving multiple franchises, or is it just the narrative he puts on? Let me know in the comment section below. And while you're over there, like this video if you enjoyed it, and subscribe to stay up to date with the best basketball content. My Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok are all in the description, so follow me for even more content. And as always, cheers.